The young man slept fitfully on the ground, his dreams full of rage and regret. Tall castles stood in swirling chaos, in places far beyond his reach. Soldiers in blunted armor traded blows with spear and sword and shield, as wyverns flew overhead. There were cries of pain and cheers of joy, and grimaces of hard-fought battles. But he was not among them, stolen away in the darkness, and hovering over all of it were those two piercingly blue eyes. From them he felt the greatest pain. Ever a light sleeper, he half heard the steps approaching him across the gravel dirt, choosing to ignore them. What couldn't be ignored was the sharp kick that struck into the side of his body. With a start and a growl, Husam shot upright as his eyes blasted open and his hand instinctively ran to his sword. "You're late again for watch, muckbacker," Constable Gallowar said with an even louder growl, standing over him with hot fire in his eyes. The young man turned his attention to the 6 wagons that made up their sorry caravan, his thoughts on the 40 or so people that completed them. Small tents stood quietly pitched between them among thinning trees. It was late in the evening. The dragon and orphan moons edged westward towards the morning. The young man scoffed. "You're still here. Caravan is still here. What else fucking matters? Get up and do your job, or I'll half your rations till we get to stocks." "Gonna be hard to protect these people when you starve your guards," Husam growled.
"When you actually start doing your job, I might begin to worry," the constable replied sharply. "Go replace Bonifac. He's practically falling over himself with exhaustion." Husam stood up with a bitter sigh as he donned his armor, slid the round shield at his back, and fixed the only true companion he'd ever known to his side, the sword. The days were long, but he was used to those. What chafed him was something else, a pain not so easily repaired. The young man had known better things, and he had lost them. Constable Gallowar continued to stare at him sternly as he slowly marched towards the outer circle of the caravan, and the 3 standing guards who made up the watch. Husam could feel the eyes following him at his back, caring some for it, but not enough for him to show it. The man didn't understand. None of them did. As the young man approached, Magdalena and Levi turned towards him. The agitation in the rough woman's face was clear enough, even within the shadows of the evening. Levi stood in mismatched quilted armor and dented helmet, the ever-present questioning stare plastered across his face.
Well, glad the half-blooded champion would be so kind as to grace us with his presence.
Magdalena growled, stepping forward with a spear in one hand. Husam fixed his eyes firmly upon her. His own fire rose in his chest.
"I'm the second in command here on this stupid caravan, and you will treat me with some respect."
And what are you going to do if I don't want to?
He shot towards her suddenly, closing the distance between them in a blink. Magdalena, startled, backpedaled and tripped over her own feet, falling to the ground. She cried out as her body struck the dirt. The agitation had suddenly vanished from her face, replaced with a wide-eyed look of shock. The young man stood over her and scoffed. A properly trained soldier would have stood their ground. An experienced soldier might have rose to fight him. These guards he shared company with weren't even fit to be 4th-string conscripts from Karul. "Providence, did you really need to do that?"
Husam turned to his left, to the tired voice that spoke those words. Bonifac leaned against a solitary tree, some steps off. He was dressed in coarse-hewn leather armor, and the bow ever at his side. His metal helmet was only dirty, and at least not dented.
"Go get some sleep, Bonifac," he replied. "Your relief is here."
The sheepish guard stared at him for a hesitant moment, before nodding his head and walking back towards the wagons. In a moment further, he disappeared among the shadows of the late evening.
Whole lot of nerve you have for an indecent half-lordling bastard.
Husam frowned at the jab and stifled a groan. Bastard. That was a title he knew too well. One that had chased after him his entire life. She knew his backstory, or at least the gossip of it. There were whispers, loud whispers, among the caravan, and he heard pieces of them. But it was wrong. They were wrong. All of it was such utter horseshit. He turned back towards the woman who had said it. Magdalena stood up from the ground, having recovered herself.
"Go do a round of the camp, Magdalena," he growled. "Or go find your bedroll and sleep. I don't care. Unless you want something worse than what I just gave you." The woman stood her ground some moments as her hand danced over the handle of a rusted sword at her hip. Her eyes remained darkly fixed on him, with seething intent to strike. Husam stared back at her, unfazed, almost wanting her to try it. He knew it wouldn't end well for her. There was a small question whether she did. Ultimately, the woman surrendered, her hand flying away from the blade as she stomped off into the darkness. Her poisonous grumblings rose out and behind her as she disappeared. Husam walked over to the solitary tree among the rolling hills and thinning forests. He leaned back against it with arms crossed and closed his eyes. Heading southward, their caravan would be making Astium in about 3 days. Then there was the string, and then there was the mining town of Stocks in the heart of the southern shelf. Then there was the rest of this fucking commission. His banishment. Each day took him further away from those piercing blue eyes, that long golden hair, and the beauty of the woman who was so much more than just that. That bitter and persistent pain continued to pull at the tethers of his heart. "That was mad what you did. You are a great warrior, aren't you? They say you're the Ironwood patron's bastard son." Husam cracked open an eye to the inquiring voice of the one remaining guard. Levi stood in front of him some couple steps away, the ever-present, empty, questioning stare plastered across his face. "Is that what they say?" The young man replied indifferently in an effort to deflect it. "Is it true you cheated on a princess?" Levi persisted under the demurred glare of the dragon and orphan moons. "Is it true that's why you're here?" Husam grimaced silently as the pain rose stronger within his chest. Levi's words stoked the fires of memories that he wished gone. But even at the best of moments, those embers persisted within defiantly. The young man continued to lean against his lonely tree and said nothing. "Well, not sure if Delena will be coming back. Watch is going to be a lot worse without her," the errant guard commented to himself. "If she doesn't come back, I'll take her rounds," Husam replied. "There's nothing that's going to attack us out here. Not even sure why Constable Gallowar is bothering with these watches." They were far from the front of the war, and only getting further from it. The young guard turned to him. "Well, that is something, I guess." It was going to be a long night. They were all long nights. There were long days filled with nothing but routine. There was no promise of a glorious future here. There were just the days and the nights, the wagon wheels turning, the people walking, heading southward and away from everything that he'd ever known. It mattered little, he tried to tell himself, over and over again. But that never worked. Something always felt off about it. All he could think about, though, was what he had truly loved, and what he had lost in pursuit of it. He thought of Princess Celestine. The young man was living in the memory of his past. First, he smelled the familiar scent of whispering grasses caught in a fall breeze. The sun showed itself against the shadows of his thoughts. A clear blue sky on a cool fall day. There was music playing, minstrels working light tunes of celebration. A bright chorus of conversation sounded like a dull roar in the back of his mind. each word indistinguishable from the other. A great many nobles gathered in a shining glade, patrons and matrons of their territories, drinking Solari wine and talking of the bright days ahead of them. His father held close confidence with the matron, surrounded by a crowd of the most powerful people on the continent. The scorched imperator had been halted near the shores of the Gadakanas, his hard advance defeated by the bravery and sacrifice of his father's people, and the newly unified nations of the East. The battles had even found a new name, the War of the Burning Eagle. He was part of this, and he wasn't. His father had raised him like a noble, but never failed to remind him that he wasn't. It placed him in awkward company, somewhere between the soldiers and servants, the nobles and rulers. He turned his head back and forth between the crowd of adults and their children, in a space just off from their parents. The cracking repetition of striking wood filled the air some space off from him, a familiar drumbeat. Husam found himself drawn by the sound, away from the glade where the royal adults consorted, to an off-center circle of open turf. Young boys and ladies played at play swords, working the careful steps of trained conflict. The Princess Celestine stood among them. Under the shade of a nearby tree, she watched with studying eyes, with arms crossed and a practice blade held at her hip. He stared long at her, like he did at their first meeting, some bare hour past. It had been the introduction of one family's ruler to another. She had long golden hair and intense blue eyes like her mother. There was petulant grace in how she carried herself. The shared greetings had been courteous enough, but brief. The impatient princess had sought to escape the stern gaze of her mother in every motion. It had been a common practice of Husam's as well, any time he found himself in the company of nobles. He had found himself instantly drawn to her.
"What does this bastard son seek among us?"
The words dashed him from his daydream as his attention returned to the present and the circle of young royals practicing with practice swords. Husam's steps had carried him closer to the other young nobles than he'd intended. In the circle of 14 or so children, many looked down at him disdainfully. They knew what Husam was, and he wasn't one of them. Another of the children thrust an insult out. "Have you lost your tongue, half-son of Raver?" The second insult nudged him into recovery from his initial awkwardness. The judging eyes on him knew nothing of what he had seen or done. His father's patronage was the front of the war, and the scorched imperator had almost conquered it. They had been so close to defeat that even he had been pressed into the battle. A young boy who fought with his own countrymen. He faced the challenge with words of anger. "I have every right to be here as any of you." Derenk, the largest of the boys, stepped forward from the crowd of people. "This is a duel for nobles, and not a place for half-blooded mongrels of helpless nations." Husam stood alone, or he felt that way, his muscles tensing as he forced his head up at the larger figure standing in front of him. He could feel the eyes of all the others on him. The boy looked down at him with a sneer, as Husam's hand clenched into a fist.
"My mother disagrees with you, Prince of Kurul. Raver fought bravest among all of us."
A young girl's voice called from a space behind him. Husam turned his head to Celestine leaning against the tree. Those words from her came unexpectedly in his defense. His attention held too long for what should have been a fleeting moment on her, enough for her eyes to turn to his. He pulled his head away in an awkward blink just as they met. "Keep your eyes away from the matron's daughter."
"I can speak for myself, Derenk."
Celestine moved from her place at the tree, approaching Husam. She paused astride in front of him and carefully looked him over. Husam brought his head up to meet hers. The faint touch of a grin rose to her face. She had a certainty that Husam lacked in this circle of royalty. This was not his place. He was a stranger here, and he felt every bit of it. but in the confidence of those eyes he found strength. His father's people had been pushed to an edge that none of these nobles could dream of, and he had fought with them. "I can take any of you Harridan royals," Husam growled. "I dare you to say that again." He heard the Prince of Kurul threaten him at his back. He turned from the gaze of the matron's daughter, confronting the crowd of other royal children surrounding him. Husam's words rang loudly.
"I'll say more than that. You're all hiding behind words. I say you're too afraid to fight someone who has known real battle."
He heard the whistling sound of slicing wind and dodged back instinctively from the wooden sword that sought to strike him. His head shot to the wielder of the blade and the hate-filled eyes that stared back at him. With heaving chest, the Prince of Kurul stood before him. "Your mother is just a whore, and you're nothing without your father. Know your place, bastard." Durank seethed. A wood blade clattered at his feet. Husam stared down at it a moment before turning to the hand of the princess who had thrown it to him. He saw the empty place at her hip and recognized the weapon as her own.
"Defend yourself, fair bastard,"
Celestine said with a level gaze and maybe a touch of amused doubt.
"I hope you're more than just the bravado."
He nodded, lifting the practiced blade from the ground with his own hands. The weight was reassuring. "I'll show you, fair princess." He sighed with pleasure as he swung the tool in his hands. Battle, simple and straightforward. This was what he knew. This is far more comfortable than any gathering of royal society. Durank swung at him again. Husam parried it. The rest of the royals backed away, forming a space for the sudden duel set before them. The two took to their positions. Husam held the gaze of his adversary, working a slow and purposeful sidestep that the other matched. His heart was shaking with excitement and just a touch of fear. He had trained and fought with both sword and shield, and there was no guard to be offered to him here. But he ignored that fear. He thought of the girl who had given him the blade. There had been faith in her actions, and he wanted to prove it justified. "I know how this ends, and you will soon. You have already lost. I have been trained by the greatest dueling sword in the East," Durank said scornfully. Husam stared back at him soberly. It was just more words, and he knew it. The best training on the continent meant nothing in the face of its necessary execution. Husam knew this prince for the nation he hailed from. They had blasted into the Yellowed Plains, conquered smaller territories to the south before the shaky alliance had been made. But they had never succeeded in taking any of his father's lands. An alliance did not banish the bad blood of nations that had fought against each other in ages past. Husam struck forward with his blade. Durank parried it with the retort of his own. Husam backpedaled. Practiced sword struck against practiced sword. The larger boy worked a dancing refrain of spinning. Husam paused in his pursuit, eyes level and waiting as he sought an opening. The Prince of Kurul dashed his blade out in 3 quick successions. Husam parried, dodged, and raised his arm up to block the third instinctively. He corrected in the blink and barely avoided the third strike leveled at him. "You don't seem to be so fast for a battle-hardened warrior," Durank mocked. He let the words fall from him, but Husam knew them true, or at least slower than the dexterity of the boy before him. Without the guard at his left arm, he felt exposed. With a shield, he could have corrected for this, but he refused to make an excuse of it. Durank struck out twice at him in quick succession. Husam dodged. A third, delayed strike barely missed at his legs. The Prince of Kurul continued his attack. Husam dodged and parried well enough, but could not muster a proper attack of his own. Practice sword again struck against practice sword. The prince worked with disciplined dancing steps, and Husam endeavored to match him. Durank thrusted him, and Husam lifted his left arm instinctively again, trying to use the shield that he didn't have. He caught his air and corrected, turning a step and narrowly dodging the blade in time. The Prince of Kurul began to laugh. Husam found all of this frustrating, caught with only half of what he was accustomed to. He was fire and sweat and stifled movement. Anger ran within him as sword struck to sword. In the present situation, he knew he was going to lose. But there was more to any real fight than just swordplay. There was also strategy. Husam knew this and worked his steps purposefully to gain a shield. He had to win for the blonde-haired beauty looking on. He had to win for his sword in his hand. He took one step off center and carefully backed away. Varyunk predictably took this as retreat and thrust at him. He parried and retorted with his own strike, buying the time for one more step back. You seem to be running out of space, half-son of Raver. He had to win because this ass of Karul was really pissing him off. He wanted a little more than to knock that arrogant sneer from his face. Husam was getting closer, letting this prince think he pressed him into a wall. The dueling circle was not so big. 3 quick strikes came at him. He parried and earned the time for that one last step back. The matron's daughter was so close he swore he could feel the warmth from her body. His intentions all came down to correct timing. He hoped he was right. Varyunk leveraged his back leg, readying another lunge against Husam. Husam yanked at Celestine's arm with his free hand, casting her between the two of them in the dueling circle. She stared at Husam, wide-eyed in shock, and turned to the prince. Varyunk startled in the sudden shift and faltered in the forward thrust of his sword. Husam acted on the opening. Trained by the best dueling sword in the East, and fuck him. Husam was a child of war. He danced around the living shield between them, found the opening he needed, and struck at the ass of Karul. His wooden practice sword found its intended mark. Varyunk gasped and fell to his knees. The bastard son pulled the blade back, twirled, and struck him on the back of his head. He followed a 3rd time on his back for good measure. The larger boy cried out in pain and collapsed to the ground, defeated. The surrounding group of children stared on silently with wide eyes of shock. The matron's daughter, clearly shaken, turned from the fallen prince to Husam as he approached her. He spun the blade in his arm, handle out, to Celestine for her to take. I believe this is yours, my lady. She regarded him and the blade a moment. The shock in her face gave way to a grinning admiration. Red rose to her face in a fluster as her eyes lingered on him for some moments. She retrieved her blade from his outstretched arm.
It really wasn't just bravado.
Celestine's unguarded words brought a fluttering in his chest. A never-before-felt grin, wider than he'd ever known, came brilliantly to Husam's face in response. Then a fist struck him in the face from a place unseen. Husam flew to the ground. 3 other children jumped him. He fought with flailing arms and hailing kicks. Bruises given returned as the boy twisted and struggled his way up through them.
Burn you! You're just a lousy cheater!
The matron's daughter recovered quickly and cast herself into the fray in Husam's defense. With a wooden sword, she struck at those who struck at the bastard's son, endeavoring to clear the mob around him. But the crowd was too much for her. The brawling young royals shoved her to the side. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Husam saw a defeated grimace on her face. The fight drew others' attention. The adults dashed into the ruckus. His father, the matron, and the noble's servants. They rushed forward to break up the fight. Hands pulled at smaller hands, at tunics or pants where they could. The gathered children found themselves forcefully pulled apart. The felled Prince of Karul stood up slowly, surrounded by his parents and courtiers. There were tears in the boy's eyes.
That Scamelot, cheating bastard!
He whined. Husam wanted to laugh as his father pulled him away from the chaos. His stepmother chastised him.
Can we not leave you alone for a moment?
All that Husam could feel was joy. He ignored Elizabeth's words and craned his neck behind him, searching for Celestine. In the crowds of moving people, he could not find her, though he did note the colors of the matron's servants searching for her as well. They walked some space away. The residual noise of the scene behind them slowly gave way to the divided quiet of the glade.
Roland turned to his wife, walking beside him. Elizabeth, please tend to our daughters. I must talk with my son alone. She stood her ground sternly.
You won't let him off this, will you?
She growled.
You know what the matron has done for us. You know how important this confederation is to all of us.
Roland nodded acknowledgement. His stepmother turned her eyes from her husband to the boy beside him, not fully convinced. After a further moment, she resigned herself, and with a nod headed away. Roland, the Ironwood patron, turned to his son. I am gonna have to punish you, but I would like to know first how you beat that Harridan prince. He does have something of a reputation in dueling circles. Husam told him what happened. Roland regarded him carefully. And the matron's daughter came to no harm? Husam nodded his head solemnly. The Ironwood patron smiled down at his son warmly after a moment. Well played, he said, pulling his son closer beside him. Sternness came slowly to his father's voice. But don't ever do it again. Choices like that make enemies. You must never forget that we are supposed to be allies, and what that means. Husam stared up at his father, hearing the seriousness in those words. I won't. Roland placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder as they walked some further space together. He turned to look him over more carefully. How badly are you hurt? The excitement of the past was still too near for him to know the pain of whatever beating he had taken. His injuries would mend. But something else had happened. Something Husam couldn't know. He turned his head to the forest and the way behind him, seeking the one true royal who had stood in his defense. Celestine. But she was nowhere to be seen.
And welcome to the end part of the story. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. If you have, please like, comment, subscribe. If you haven't, I still don't get it, but I feel like that's a very small portion of you ultimately. Anyway, this is the end section where I kind of briefly, and I mean briefly, kind of go over the 6 different artists, 4 different composers, and 2 different female voice actresses who contributed their, various great talents to help me realize this, this little bit of a passion project of mine, which is kind of these, these fantasy side stories that are developing this world, establishing characters that are leading into this kind of greater narrative, which is ultimately the story of the rise of, these 3 people in this great and tragic triumvirate. There should be kind of examples popping up on either side right here, and like down below, places where you can basically find them. Vast majority of them came off of Fiverr. Everyone that I ended up using were talented, decent, honest. There were some people that I haven't used that have had their own problems. Definitely me, when I was starting out at the beginning, I definitely made my own mistakes. Everything is kind of a learning process, ultimately. But you have like the 6 artists, the 4 musicians, which I'm going to list off right here and stand over quietly as I kind of bring them up a little bit. Generally, weirdly speaking, I got to say that the general customer service I've gotten out of like the music talent has been probably higher, I think, than a lot of like the different artists in general. Main theme being Franco Donadio has done fantastic art, which is what you should be hearing right now. It's some classy ass jazz, which I love quite a bit. Anyway, if you enjoy this content, you can feel free to check me out on Instagram. I also have some like added art that didn't make the cut, some of the art that did, and kind of going over the process of how to how I go through that to like establish it. And a lot of it comes down to just good communication. And I think that really covers everything that I need to on there. Hopefully you can saw everything else on that end. And really on that note, salut.